Okay, so now we're going to take a look at the string class. So we've already seen strings throughout our programs a little bit. So now what I want to go ahead and do is take a moment to go into a little bit more detail about the string class. A little bit later, we will go into much greater detail about this idea of classes. But for now, we'll just give a brief overview. So unlike our primitive data types, strings are actually going to be objects of the string class. So these classes, essentially these Java files that we have, you can think of these like the blueprints that we use to make our objects. Each object is going to be an instance of our class. So it's basically just a single instance of a kind of realization of those blueprints. So the concepts of classes and objects will be expanded on in much greater detail later. So to continue to just briefly kind of clarify the difference with our class type variables, these, unlike our primitive types, which hold the value specified by the literal, say like when you're dealing with some int, maybe you call it number, you give it the value 50. So if you were to go and look inside of that number box, so using that box analogy, you would find the value 50 inside of that box. But that's not really the case with strings. So with our class type variables, these are actually going to hold a reference. So it's essentially some address somewhere else in memory where the object itself is located. So if you create a string variable, so you've essentially got some box and you want to try to put a string into it, what you're actually going to put into it is going to be a reference, basically an address to some other box somewhere else that actually holds your string object. So that's where you would actually find, say, your string literal, like this name that we have here, Joe Mahoney. So there's also going to be this possibility of using a null reference. So basically with a null reference, the best way to describe this is that you can kind of think of it like assigning 0 to a number. It's essentially going to be like nothing. So when I talk about this reference variable, it's kind of like you're referencing nothing. It wouldn't even be like referencing an empty string object. It's just nothing. In most practical cases, you should avoid using null references, or you should carefully consider how you will handle null references. Typically, if you're going to give a string a null reference initially, you want to guarantee that that string will hold some value a little bit later in your code. There's going to be a couple of different ways to address this that we'll talk about later. This will include things like asking the user to assign a value to it, or doing some kind of check to see what value is inside of it. So we can see an example here. We've created some string. So our variable is called name. The contents of that variable, so what's inside of that box, is going to be an address. But the address in this case is basically going to be nothing. So you kind of think of it like if you're using maybe a piece of paper that you put inside of the box that has some instructions written on it, like directions to the other box. This would be like if you just had a blank piece of paper with no directions to any other box. So just nothing, basically. So once we've actually created one of these objects, we've got some contents, so not a null reference, but an actual string literal for our that goes with our string variable. We can then go ahead and perform some operations on it in the form of methods. So we've seen a couple of these already. We've seen the print and println methods that we use with our system class. We've seen the pow and the sqrt square root method for our math class. So now what I'm going to talk about is methods that we are using not on the class itself, say like system or math, but methods that we're going to use on objects of the class. So the syntax looks pretty much the same. You're still going to see that dot notation that separates, in this case, the object name and the method that you want to use. So go ahead and minimize this. We'll take a quick look. We'll go ahead and remove project and go ahead and create a new one. So for this one, we'll go ahead and create a Java project. Make it a Java application. We'll call this one strings. So this would be strings. Make absolutely sure that it's plural. We'll go ahead and finish that. We'll go ahead and remove our extra comments that we don't need. clean this up a little bit. Go ahead and adjust the style on this. And right here, we'll go ahead and just include, to start off with, just a print statement. So we'll do system.out.println. And maybe inside of here, we would just put in, let's say we put in the string literal hello world. And we can see right here that dot notation that I'm talking about. So we've got system dot and then out and then another dot. So system is going to be a class. To talk a little bit about this very briefly, out is going to be an object that we're trying to get that's somewhere inside of this class. And then println is going to be the method that we want to use. So in this particular case, since we're doing it as, say if we look at just this portion here, we've got our out.println. So this is a good example of exactly the syntax that I'm talking about, where out is going to be some object of a class, and then we have the dot, and then we have our print line. In this case, out is not going to be for the string class, it's going to be for some other class. We're not going to worry too much about the specific internal details of this, but the syntax for it is at least very similar. Additionally, if we want to take a look at a case where we have a method with a class itself, we have those methods from the math class, so we have like math.pow, and then you give it two numbers, say like 4 and 2. So this is a pretty good example as well. In this case, we're dealing with not necessarily an object of a class, but the class itself. But we have that dot notation, and then we've got the name of some method that we want to use. So we got math.pow, and then we give it some values, say in this case 4 squared, try to get the value 16 from that. So what we're taking a look at here with the string class, we've got a couple of different methods that we can look at. It is important to keep in mind that this is not going to be all of the methods for the string class. There are many others besides these. But to go through 4 examples, we've got char at, and then we specify some kind of index for it. We've also got a length, 2 lowercase, and a 2 uppercase. So if we take a look, we can see some examples of each of these. So we're going to go ahead and use that string Joe Mahoney, and we're going to apply each one of those different methods to that string. So go ahead and minimize this. We'll come over here, and we'll go ahead and create that string. So we're going to say string. We're going to call this name. This is going to be equal to the name Joe Mahoney. And then right here, if we take a look, going through each one of our different methods that we want to call. So the very first one, we're going to use char at, and then we specify an index. That index basically means some position somewhere in that string. One of the things to note about the positions of all the different characters in a string is that these are going to be zero-based, meaning that the capital J that we see at the very beginning of Joe Mahoney, that is going to be position 0 of our string. The lowercase o right next to it is going to be position 1. The lowercase e is going to be position 2. There's then going to be that space between Joe and Mahoney. That space is going to be position 3. The capital M in Mahoney is going to be position 4, and then so forth and so on. So we'll go ahead and include a print statement right here. We're going to say system.out.println, and inside of here we're going to put in our name. So we're going to put the variable that we want to use. We're then going to have that dot notation, and then we're going to specify the method that we want to use on that object. So we're going to say char at, and then we'll give it an index. So by default, if it just auto-completes it for you, it's going to use 0. So if we go ahead and save this and we run it, it's going to give us the capital J right there. And also, I'm going to go ahead and comment these 2 lines out so we can just kind of ignore them. And then, of course, if we want to, we can move this around to other positions. So if we go from position 0 up to position 1, we go ahead and save that, and we run it. Now it's going to give us the lowercase o, so that's going to be this position right here. If we move over to the next one, position 2, go ahead and save this and run it. That's going to be the e, so that's this character right here. If we do 3, we can run that. we're not going to see anything here because it's going to be this space right here. So that space is just completely blank, doesn't really look like anything to us. That's position 3 of our string. Do one more, we do position 4, and save that, and we run it, and it's going to give us that capital M. It's going to be this character right here. For the next part, we are looking at the length method. So this is going to print out the length of the name string. Again, just like when we were looking at char@, remember that that white space is part of that string. So if we count this out, let's minimize this. We'll come over to our NetBeans project and count this out. So we've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. So there are 11 characters inside of that string, Joe Mahoney. So if we go ahead and get the length, so we're going to say system.out.println, and we'll do name.length. We'll save that, and we'll run it, and we'll see that we get that number 11 printing to the console. So this is a pretty handy method when you need to check how long, the number of characters that a particular string happens to be. In addition, going through these last two methods, we've got 2 lowercase and 2 uppercase. So for these two methods, the names are a bit more intuitive. What they do is a bit more obvious. With 2 lowercase, what this is going to do is if you have any alphabetical characters in your string, it's going to make them all lowercase. And then with 2 uppercase, again, if you have any alphabetical characters in your string, it's going to make them all capitalized or make them all uppercase. So we'll go ahead and test out both of those methods. We got system.out.println. We'll go ahead and do name.toLowercase. And then we'll also do system.out.println. And we'll do name.toUppercase. Go ahead and save that. And then we'll run it. And you'll see for the first one, we've got the name Joe Mahoney. It's now in all lowercase, so the J and the M are both lowercase. But then if we look at the last one, it's going to be every single character, every single letter is going to be capitalized. Everything's to uppercase. One other thing that I'll go ahead and note about the names of our methods, you might notice that the way that these are being named, or the convention that's being used, is very similar to the convention that I recommended for your variable names. They're going to be using that camel case where the very first character, or the very first letter is lowercase, but then if you have a new word somewhere inside of that method name, the first letter of that new word is going to be capitalized. So say like with 2 lowercase, the T is lowercase, the L is capitalized, and the C is capitalized. With 2 uppercase, the T is lowercase, the U is capitalized, and the C is capitalized. And then also if we take a look at char@, see the same thing. So we've got char, the C is lowercase, and then @ the A is capitalized. So this is going to wrap up everything for the string class, at least for now. Eventually we're going to go into even more detail about this. We'll also eventually start introducing more methods that we can use. Getting into the next video, I want to go ahead and take another look at the scope of variables in our Java programs.